Hi, and welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your resident question asker, Mark Simon, here with our VP of Football, Matt Manocherian. Today we bring in John Shirley from our Research and Development team and Corey March, our gaming expert from the Business Development Group. We're in full off-season mode, which means we'll be doing episodes on some higher-level topics, and today is one of those days. We're going to look at a new tool that we've developed. It's an injury prediction model. It actually gives a couple of projections on the likelihood of a player getting injured within a given time span. Matt, start us off here. What are the most important things to know about this?
I mean, the first thing that's important to know is that it's really cool. I mean, obviously, it's not such a great topic, predicting injuries. Nobody likes to think of a player getting injured, and we're definitely sensitive to that. We're talking about humans here, but at the same time, injuries is something, I've been on the inside with teams, and the way it gets talked about a lot of the times is players that have been injured in the past are more likely to get injured going forward, and players that are healthy are likely to be healthy. And there's really not much nuance to it, beyond that. You literally have players taken off the draft board because it just says this guy's too high an injury risk, we can't draft him. And that's that, no matter what the evaluation is, no matter what the actual risk level that if you really quantified it would go into there. So this is us actually quantifying that. And it's all built on our in-depth injury collection. And really, anybody who's tried to do this sort of work before in the past knows how difficult this is. Injuries are such rare occurrences. They're really hard to project. And, John can talk a little bit about what he did in terms of the model building here. But to kind of tee up John a little bit in terms of, because this is all him. He's been the driving force behind building our injury models for both baseball and football, I'll add. In terms of what's going on here, it's really being able to put a number to the likelihood of an injury. The model is completely predicated on the data that we collect. So it's our in-game injury data collection. It's all of our video scouts really focusing hard on making sure any sort of potential injury event, not just actual injuries, things that get reported, but even more intricate than that. We couple that with media reports, and we're covering all 32 NFL teams, all 130 teams from the FBS, getting every possible media report in. And then all of that gets reviewed by our kinesiology expert, John Veros. We've talked about him on the program many times before in the past. And what you get is this clean and thorough injury data collection, which when you add that to all of our other football data that we have, you can do some pretty powerful stuff with. So, without getting into all the diagnosis and prognosis and severity scale that we use, all that kind of stuff that gets a little bit into the nitty gritty. I think from a high level, it's a really important question to ask. What's the likelihood of injury? And this is a really powerful tool to do it. That's all built on this really powerful data set. So yeah, John, what can you say about how the actual model got put together and what goes on in terms of how you projected it?
Yeah, so the first major thing with any of these models is kind of what we have to determine what we're actually trying to predict. And with these models, there's three separate models here where we have a projection for an injury that requires at least 1 week recovery time, a model for any injury that requires at least 2 weeks or longer recovery time, and a model that also does any injury that is at least a month of recovery time or further. So kind of your major injuries. So the major first step is to kind of get what we're projecting here and determining that. So then once we have that, took data from 2017 through 2019 and separated that data for all these players into a training and a test data set. And then we used a machine learning model that has inputs for all of that injury data that you kind of overviewed there. A lot of performance metrics, a lot of usage metrics for players just over time and how those things change, some body type specific stuff like BMI, age.
So I think it's important to point out too that the reason why we went with the multiple model approach and not just the one time frame was when we started showing the prototypes of this to NFL teams, we got a lot of that feedback that was, okay, that's great that you've predicted the likelihood of missing 1 week, but how do we know if the guy's going to miss a month or more? What about the real serious, the real impactful injuries? And so that's the reason for the multiple models, just to kind of peel behind the curtain there a little bit.
Corey, I'll get to you in a second. John, what are the most important inputs that get considered within this projection?
We did separate players into defensive players, skill position, and offensive line. So that question kind of depends on what position the player plays, but generally over kind of throughout all of the models is a lot of the injury history metrics. We find players that have sustained a lot of injuries in the past do actually sustain more injuries or have a higher projected for injuries in the future. Age plays a factor for the positions. And then depending kind of on again, with what position we're talking about, a lot of the usage metrics found that players kind of out in space sustain higher levels of injuries. Corners, wide receivers, if you're like a running back that splits out wide, might have a higher injury risk, or a tight end that does that because you're playing more in space.
We're going to get to the age issue in a little bit because there's some names that are going to come up that are going to surprise you with regards to that. Corey, how can this model be applied to your world of gaming and gambling?
In terms of utility in fantasy football, there's a lot of public perception out there about who's injury prone and who's not. I think looking at this model will give you a more realistic perception of who's likely to get injured, who's not, and actually lead you to the realization that some of these guys aren't as likely to get hurt as they are. So it should affect your comfort level. In terms of applying it to gaming and sports betting, I think this has real utility in terms of thinking about team totals and betting on team over under win totals going into the season. If we're talking about high leverage players like quarterbacks who can be worth several wins to their team and they're up there high on the injury risk board, and these guys go on to get hurt, that's definitely going to impact the team's overall win total. And you may want to take that into consideration when placing your bets before the season.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people playing like underdog these days too, and all this kind of season, year-long stuff, best ball. I can imagine it would probably have an impact there too.
Definitely. I think I'm going to be referencing some underdog rankings as we go through the show. I think underdog and best ball especially is where injuries play a big factor because you're drafting ahead of the season and then those guys are on your roster. They're locked in for the rest of the season. So you want to try and limit the injury risk as much as you can.
Yeah, Mark, not to get too nuanced here, but there's a little bit of an interesting thing going on where I said old school football people just say if you're injured a lot, you have a likelihood of getting injured. And then John comes on and he says, yes, the model shows that that's true. But I think that what's really useful here and what it kind of comes back to what Corey's saying is what's really useful is knowing that it's not just like an 100% chance that somebody's going to get injured again. Actually, these percentages are much lower than that. Most of the time, players, they're more likely to not get injured than they are to get injured. Even if they've been injured a lot before. So really putting a number to it and having kind of these calibration estimate, all of the stuff that John does, optimizing the ROC, AUC that we're not going to talk about on the podcast. But all of that stuff can just give you a much better baseline than your intuition.
All right, so let's get player specific here. We won't get too deep, but we can look at some players and see what their numbers indicate. John, who has the highest chance of missing more than a week due to injury?
At the current projections, Cowboys linebacker Leighton Vander Esch has the highest chance of being sustaining an injury that would require at least 1 week of recovery time.
That's an interesting thing you said there, John. You said the current, and I think what you meant by that, if I'm reading you right, is that this model updates every day. So as we get more information, whether it's in the off season or in the regular season, as more and more information comes in, this model will actually update throughout. So this is as of today, we're looking at it. You're saying Leighton Vander Esch has the highest probability. What do you think is going in that underlies that?
So a lot of it is his injury history the last couple of years. He's had some neck injuries. Last season, he missed some time with a collarbone injury, ankle injury. So he's kind of had injuries to different parts of his body and has missed quite a bit of time the last couple seasons. So I think that's a big factor kind of in that risk.
And I think when you look at the Cowboys, John, you pointed out earlier, it's similar with the Sean Lee situation, kind of bad luck with a good player there. But Micah Parsons and Jabril Cox in the draft, both brought in, certainly going to bolster that position group. I think Parsons especially is a little bit of a different player than you're talking about with the Vander Esch. But I think Jabril Cox can fill a lot of the sort of things that he does in both phases there. So you can see that the Cowboys, this is no surprise to anybody that Vander Esch has high injury risk, and the Cowboys are already building to replace.
So in terms of the Cowboys' outlook this season, the NFC East is very hotly contested according to the Vegas odds. The Cowboys are actually projected to finish first. I don't think that's too surprising. And I also don't think that if Leighton Vander Esch were to go down, that it would impact their win total or necessarily their probability to win the division. Early on in his career, he really jumped off the screen as a really high impact linebacker, but the numbers actually show over the past couple of seasons that he actually ranks -7 points above replacement, which is a metric that we created here at SIS to contribute to our wins above replacement metric.
Not good to be below replacement level.
Staying in the division, who has the highest chance of missing multiple consecutive weeks?
For that model, it would be the Eagles tackle Lane Johnson. He leads in that, unfortunately, that we're projecting him to miss multiple weeks. Some of the factors that kind of play into that are, unlike Van Der Esch, who's kind of on the younger side, Johnson's actually on the wrong side of 30 there on the offensive line, and has also battled some injury history issues in the past couple seasons. He's had some lower body injuries with his ankle and knee, and has missed some time there. So kind of the two main factors there is his age and injury history. And then he also obviously plays a lot. And the more you play, the more chances for injuries to occur.
I mean, Lane Johnson has a more extensive injury history than I realized. One thing you didn't mention, John, also, he does have a concussion history, which I'm sure is playing into the model too. And I mean, he's a player that's really important to them. They had a great offensive line, obvious need to rebuild it with him and some other guys getting a little bit older. And one thing that really jumps out from a statistical perspective was from the on-off splits app. The Eagles couldn't pass the ball whether or not Lane Johnson was on the field last year, but he was much better. Their run game was much better with him on the field than off of it. About 6 expected points added per 60 plays better with him on than with him off in the run game. So you can't underestimate his contributions in the run game as well as the pass game if they can ever get that fixed up.
In terms of how this could affect fantasy, first off, I think it would be bad for Jalen Hurts' development overall. But in terms of fantasy, I think there are ways to look at it that it could actually possibly benefit Jalen Hurts' fantasy outlook. The fact that maybe this could lead to the Eagles playing from behind more and forced to put more points on the board. The fact that he could be forced to run the ball more could lead to more fantasy points. Hurts is being drafted as the quarterback 8 on Underdog Fantasy, which stood out to me as high. But when you think about it, the skills that he brings to the table for fantasy are
running quarterbacks in fantasy.
Exactly. I actually found a fun fact about Jalen Hurts and Lane Johnson. Jalen Hurts and Lane Johnson have played 9 snaps together, and they were all runs by Jalen Hurts. That was during the era when Jalen Hurts was just coming on the field to run quarterback. So now that's their starting quarterback.
All right. So staying on the offensive line, who has the highest chance of missing at least 1 month?
Saints offensive lineman Andrews Pete. And kind of an interesting part here is, as I mentioned earlier, kind of players in space are fairly high injury risk. But overall, the position that kind of separates itself kind of oddly is guards on average have the highest injury risk. So he kind of falls into that category. With also last season, he had a concussion and an ankle sprain that he missed some time with. And then kind of with him, the couple players we talked about earlier had more serious injuries over the past season or two. He's had a lot of minor injury events that we also track that maybe he's not missing a ton of time with, but it's kind of adding up as it goes along during last season to increase his risk of maybe potentially having a longer term injury in the future.
Corey, how does that impact Alvin Kamara?
So it's obviously not good when you lose a starting offensive lineman. Fantasy owners of Alvin Kamara can rest assured knowing that in the past when Andrews Pete went out of the lineup, Kamara's performance hasn't shown any ill effects. So I think you could still draft him with confidence, even with the high injury risk there.
So we've looked at players who are high injury risks. Let's look at the players who are low injury risks. And this isn't a case of where you're just going to take who's the guy with the lowest injury risk. It's probably going to be a reserve. We looked at best players with low risk. There were 2 of note. John, you want to walk us through those?
Yeah, so a couple of interesting players that obviously have high impact, but very low injury risk here are TJ Watt and Levante David. TJ Watt, he's fairly young, and that plays a big factor here. And then also he has almost 0 injury history to speak of during his time in the NFL. So those kind of 2 main factors there are playing into it. And then some of his usage also kind of plays a factor where he's not asked to play in coverage a lot. And as I kind of mentioned, the players in space have higher injury risks. And so he's not really asked to play in space a lot. He's a primary pass rusher. He's a really good pass rusher. So, that's good that the Steelers are asking him to do almost exclusively that. So that kind of plays a big factor with him. And then on the other side with Levante David, he's a little older at 31 on the wrong side of 30. So it's kind of interesting that he has a lower injury risk, but kind of similar to TJ Watt, doesn't really have much of an injury history to speak of. And he's also pretty much exclusively used in the box. And even though he's a middle linebacker, so he's playing in coverage a little bit more, it's usually starting from in the box. When he's asked to play in coverage, it's more on a running back or a tight end or something like that, where he's not asked to go split out into the cover a receiver in the slot or something like that. So those are kind of factors that cancel out his age in the model a little bit. And so those two players kind of have a low injury risk, even though they are high usage players and very good players.
Yeah, younger edge, older off-ball player, but both of them, have played through the Knicks over the years. It's not like they don't have anything on their injury reports, but have been fortunate enough to avoid the major ones. Corey, what do you make of these two guys?
It's good to see. These are definitely two guys that their teams don't want to be without. Last year, TJ Watt was worth 20 points above replacement in terms of pass rush points above replacement, which was third best in the league. And Levante David plus 12, which was second best in terms of run defense. And his teammate Devin White was actually third best. So good for the Bucks, good for these players, good for both their teams.
Definitely good for David and Watt. All right, so we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about quarterbacks, where he's going to have some fantasy implications, some guys that you wouldn't think of being low injury risk guys. We'll be back with that in just a moment.
The Sports Info Solutions Injury Risk Model and Application is sweeping the NFL, providing never-before-seen insights to the most cutting-edge teams in the league. If you work for an NFL team as a scout, analyst, coach, trainer, or executive, and you don't have access to the SIS Injury Risk Model and Application, you're missing out on game-changing information that has endless use cases. Our model is tested and calibrated so you can take the guesswork out of injury risk projections and reliably quantify the impact of injury risk on any decisions that you make. This product is exclusively available to NFL teams, and it comes with access through both a data feed and an online interface. The model updates on a nightly basis throughout the season to take into account the constantly updating stream of information. If you work for an NFL team and are interested in learning more about the SIS Injury Risk Model and Application, please reach out to us at offthecharts@sportsinfosolutions.com.
Okay, so now let's get into a topic that I think shows a little bit of intrigue, quarterbacks. Everyone wants to know about quarterbacks. Which ones have the highest chance of getting hurt, John?
The three leaders in the chance to miss at least 1 week or more through the model. In third is Jimmy Garoppolo. The model, assuming he's the starter at right now, we haven't had a chance to factor in, that they have drafted Trey Lance and he could start at some point during the season or any of that. Then in second is Dak Prescott. He's coming off of a major injury. So that kind of somewhat describes his situation. And then kind of a surprise at the top is Kyler Murray. He's kind of an interesting player because he's young. He doesn't really have much of an injury history going on. But kind of the factors at play here are that last season he had one of the highest snap counts of any quarterback. And that's including playoffs. So he's kind of outpacing some of the players that played in the playoffs, get an extra couple weeks of games in there. And yet he still has an extremely high snap count because the Cardinals like to play fast and they like to get a lot of snaps in.
And when you say snap count, does that include run snaps, or are you saying snaps that he's involved in specifically?
It's both, really. It's just snap count in general. The next point I was going to get to is that he carries the ball quite a bit. So he's involved in a lot of plays as well. When he does carry the ball, he has an extremely high broken and missed tackle rate. So he's, using extra effort there to increase his potential for hits instead of going down or sliding or going down on, light contact. He's opening himself up for more hits and potentially bigger hits that increase the rate for quarterbacks or any ball carrier. And then even though he doesn't have a major injury history in his short career yet, he is on the higher side of some minor injury events that we're tracking. And that's probably because he's carrying the ball so much and is just such a high usage player.
So two guys that were injured most of last year and a tiny guy are the top three. Corey, what did you make of it?
Took me by surprise too. I was disappointed. I was upset to see Kyler Murray there at the top. It's just such a fun player to watch. One of my favorite players, someone who I'd hate to see get hurt, but really good information to have in your arsenal for gaming purposes. Specifically, quarterbacks, they're worth so much to their team. Last year, Kyler Murray was worth 2.5 wins above replacement. So when you get down to it, looking ahead to the season, the Cardinals have a projected win total of 8. If Kyler Murray were to go down for an extended period of time and you wipe away 2.5 wins from that win total, you're starting to look at 5.5 wins, and that's really impactful. Yeah, we know Dak Prescott's coming off of a major injury. An interesting fact about him and his teammates, All three of his teammates did a lot better with Dak Prescott on the field. That's not surprising. But Michael Gallup had the most targets on the team after Dak Prescott went down and got hurt. Before Dak Prescott's injury, he was 5th on the team in targets. So interesting point to keep in mind if you're drafting Cowboys receivers in fantasy this year. And Jimmy Garoppolo, the fantasy, we talked about him being assumed as the 49ers quarterback. Well, the fantasy community isn't really doing that. In terms of underdog draft position, Trey Lance is getting drafted as the 14th quarterback, and Jimmy Garoppolo is getting drafted as the 34th quarterback. So not a major impact there in terms of fantasy, although it'll be interesting to see what the impact is between one and the other.
So now we look at low risk starters, and this is where this model kind of blows everyone away. Your 3 lowest risk starters, there's some old guys in here, and it's very surprising. Matt, walk us through it.
The lowest risk starters, Big Ben at number 1. Obviously super surprising, just 2 years from missing almost the entire season, and he's old. Aaron Rodgers, let's hope not, but he's number 2 on the list. And then number 3, Tom Brady, Mr. Ageless himself, is tied with Tannehill, Matt Ryan, and Kirk Cousins for 3rd place. So it's cool. So with these guys, it's also about the way that they play that's actually protecting them. They're getting the ball, especially Big Ben is in shotgun, getting the ball out of his hands right away. We all saw the the next gen charts of Tom Brady in the Super Bowl compared to Pat Mahomes, where he barely moves around in the pocket and his launch points are all right there. So that's interesting that the model is picking up on that being such a strong influence in terms of the likelihood of injury. I think there's probably some tentacles that could sprawl in terms of thinking about the ramifications of that.
So just before we move on, the things here, the biggest takeaways here, that feels like one of the biggest takeaways from this whole thing is what you just said.
Yes, that's exactly right. And this ties back to the research that we talked about earlier with John Veros, where quarterbacks, it's not the running quarterbacks that necessarily are the highest risk. It's a lot of times it's the quarterbacks that scramble and try to throw on the move. And while they're getting hit, those are the real high risk injury spots. So all of this nuance into what actually increases the likelihood of injury, it's colossal at that kind of a money position.
And it's kind of common sense. And that's why Kyler and Dak Prescott are the guys at the top, as you were talking about. All right, fantasy running backs with elevated risk. We've got a short list. John, who's at the top of that list in terms of injury risk?
Yeah, so starting at the number 3 is David Montgomery from the Bears. Number 2 is Jonathan Taylor for the Colts. And the number 1 running back is Darrell Henderson Jr. from the Rams. And kind of a few factors that are playing into his higher risk is that he's ended up on IR both of the last 2 seasons with ankle injuries. So obviously a lower body injury to a running back like that is going to play a big factor, and missing a lot of time as a running back with lower body injuries like that'll play a big factor. The biggest factor too is his last injury this last season happened so late in the season. It happened, I believe, in week 16 where he injured his ankle again. So that's kind of affecting the current outlook where we sit today, because it's a fairly recent injury, and it'll be interesting to kind of see his injury risk over the first couple weeks as he gets further past that injury and see kind of how their usage in that backfield plays a part, as because as Matt mentioned, these models update all the time as we gain more information.
In terms of how these guys are affecting fantasy football and how you want to think about it that way, Darrell Henderson, the fantasy community tends to think that he is not the running back to own in Los Angeles for the Rams. Akers is being drafted as running back 8 ahead of fantasy studs like Nick Chubb and Aaron Jones. Darrell Henderson's getting drafted all the way down at 44th running back. In terms of how these guys actually play on the field, I think there's not that much separating them. I do think Akers started to come into favor down the stretch last season, but that may have had something to do with Henderson's health status. The numbers actually show Henderson performed better than Akers, but Akers did certainly seem to come alive down the stretch. And speaking of a similar type of situation, the second guy on the list, Jonathan Taylor, he was really a revelation down the stretch last year. In weeks 1 through 11, he ranked 37th among running backs with 0 points above average. So you know exactly what that means. He was exactly average. But after he came off of the COVID list, he spent 1 week on the COVID list and came back in week 13. He posted 29 points above average in that limited span, which was number 1 in the league. And as a result, he's being drafted as the running back 6 in fantasy. So hopefully, for the sake of fans and fantasy football players everywhere, Jonathan Taylor can stay healthy.
Corey, based on what you were saying, it seems to me like Darrell Henderson, just, despite the high injury risk, might be a bit of a value play. Cam Akers, one thing we look at all of these running backs, they're all kind of clustered together in a similar zone. Nobody's going to be invincible at that position. I know Akers, double-digit carries, 20 carries in 3 of the last 4 games of the last year. So you saw the workload kind of adjust. But again, you mentioned that's at the same time when Henderson was injured for some of that period of time. That kind of explains the workload a little bit there. 44th, you said the 44th running back off the board?
Yeah, 44th, Darrell Henderson. And yeah, I agree with you there. I think Darrell Henderson's a talented back. I think the Rams tend to distribute carries pretty evenly, so it ends up being detrimental to fantasy owners. So, that leads you to believe that Akers might be high, Henderson might be low, but I think it's a kind of a hot hand situation that any 3 of them could go off on any given day, and it's going to be a tough thing to predict.
All right, so let's transition to the receiver spot. At the receiver spot, the name's not as surprising as quarterbacks. Take us through, John.
Yeah, so in number 2 is Marvin Jones with the Jaguars, and the top spot is Randall Cobb with the Texans, which I don't think shouldn't be too surprising to many people. He's always kind of had some injury issues, even going back to his time with the Packers and the Cowboys. And I think a lot of the other part too is that the model does know for like receivers and tight ends and those types of players, again, where they kind of line up, guys with higher usage in the slot have kind of an increased injury risk as well when you're talking about those type of players. And that's probably due to, they're going over the middle a little more. They're playing in space, but they're also playing in space with more bigger bodies. They go across the middle. There's have potential to be hit by a linebacker or that type of stuff. So that kind of increases their risk along with just kind of their general injury history.
I think John's explanation of the types of receivers who put themselves at greater risk is more interesting from a fantasy perspective here than the actual 2 guys who appeared at the top of the list. So maybe something to keep in mind when you're drafting. What sort of receiver are you looking at? Is it the type of a player who's a vertical receiver and going to make a bunch of big plays running straight down the field? Or is it a bunch of guys, or is it a guy who's going to be in harm's way?
It's funny you say that, Corey, because correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, the slot receivers, that's one thing. And yes, receivers that run those inward breaking, those crossing routes, that's another thing. But actually, receivers that are faster, just period, that move at a faster velocity on the field, those guys have a higher injury risk. And guys that also, unsurprising, I think this one, that break tackles more. So that can often coincide with being a slot receiver. But say you're a bubble screen guy on the outside, the guys that are going to do bubble screen and try to break tackles or be a vertical over the top guy, those can be high injury risk guys too. It's really anytime you get outside of your sort of more traditional outside receiver, that there seems to be something that crops up that can snowball for some of these guys. Did I get that right, John?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's kind of the beauty of the models is that it sees different players differently and can pick out these little things like, a faster guy versus more of an older slot guy, kind of like Cobb, who might not be as fast anymore, and see that both of them have increased risk, but maybe due to different things. And the model kind of adjusts for all of those factors that are being put into it and can understand those differences.
All right, so let's slide to tight end before we look at a couple of defensive players to wrap up. At tight end, a couple of high upside guys have elevated risk. Run us through.
Yeah, so the top 2 tight ends are Logan Thomas and Noah Fant. With these 2 players, we're talking about fairly athletic tight ends that are going to be split out a little bit, run a lot of routes, play in space. I know that's kind of been a big theme that I've been talking about, but that's kind of how these models look at these players. And then also with Fant, who's the number 1 highest risk, it's not just kind of how he plays and his athleticism and those types of things. It's also due to a little bit of injury history this last season where he battled an ankle injury over a couple week period there that, lingered for a while. So that also plays a factor into his increased risk.
Yeah, both of these guys are super interesting to me. Like you mentioned, Font just missed 1 game over the last 2 years. over which time he's been kind of moderately productive, but I think has had a chance to be a guy that can really explode. I love the upside in the Broncos passing game with their receivers along with Font. In terms of on-off splits, they were much better in both the run game and the pass game with Fant on the field, which was partially unsurprising and partially surprising. So 5 expected points added per 60 plays better in the pass game. No surprise there. But they were 9 EPA per 60 plays better in the run game with Fant on the field. That part really surprised me.
Matt, it's interesting to hear you say that. When I was looking into Fant's numbers and how he did last year, great receiver. Obviously, we all know that. He's a truck. He'll run you over. His blocking numbers were among the worst in terms of points above replacement. So to hear that the Broncos were that much better in the run game with Fant on the field, surprising. It almost seems contradictory. What do you think?
You know what? I think that's an awesome follow-up point. Because here's the truth of it. Football is it's an interrelated sport, and it is totally possible for him to both be a bad blocker, which I think matches the eye test. I'm happy to hear that points above replacement feels the same thing that I would have thought about him. But it's possible to be a bad blocker and for the team to have been better running the ball with him on the field than off. There are 10 other guys out there. The defense is responding in different ways. Maybe it could be that they're positioning him as a slot receiver and pulling a linebacker out of the box, and that's having an impact on the run game. That's not going to go into his blocking rating, but that is going to help the team's run game on offense. So it's just a point about, man, this beautiful sport we call football.
All right. So on the defensive side, a couple of other guys that we want to mention besides we've already talked about, there are some big names that have high chances of missing time. At corner, Shaq Griffin, Marshawn Lattimore, and at defensive end, Chase Young and Montez Sweat. Matt, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I don't think that the Jaguars are going to really like hearing that Shaq Griffin has at least a 50% chance of missing at least 1 week. Obviously, it's not what you look for when you bring in players in free agency on their second contracts there. But in terms of the Marshawn Lattimore, what I'll say is, he's only played 16 games once in 4 seasons, but at the same time, he's never missed more than 3. So that's an important thing to keep in mind and that we're talking about here, in that this is the model that's saying that there's going to be an injury that's going to be a 1 week or more injury. It could be a 1 week injury. It could be a 10-week injury, but this is not saying that he's going to miss the entire season. So this isn't saying that the Saints or the Jaguars should panic. That said, I do think in the case of Marshawn Lattimore, you're looking at a guy who the Saints really can't afford to lose, especially in the post-Breeze era. And when you look at his performance over the past few years, he hasn't been as good over the last 3 years as he was as a rookie. All that said, it'd be tough to lose him despite the 50% injury likelihood. I don't think that's just saying 1 week. Please don't panic. Same thing goes for the Washington football team with Chase Young and Montez Sweat. I know that Washington would rather see just about anything than to lose Chase Young for an extended period of time. And I'll reiterate one more time that the model is not saying that these guys are doomed. They're just saying they have the highest likelihood of at least that 1 week injury.
So as we wrap up here, each of you, your biggest takeaway from everything related to this topic.
My biggest takeaway here is that injuries have been such just a blind spot for me. As a scout, you're constantly trying to evaluate everything about a player's play on the field, personality, athletic characteristics, injuries being just one thing on that list. And I'm not trained to understand injury risk very well. And honestly, it's not something that humans do a great job with the sort of information that's in there, unless you're talking about the doctors that actually have the ability to kind of poke and prod the players on your own team. This is a tool that gives you some insight into all the other players that aren't on your own team, all the players around the league, all potential college football players. And what I love about it is how much the way these guys are used and their characteristics and not just their injury history all kind of melds together to give you a quantifiable picture. And at the end of the day, if as a scout, I don't have to worry about predicting injury likelihood myself and I can get a computer to do it, man, that makes my job a lot easier. I can focus on the football.
For me, I'm excited about how revolutionary this model can be in the gaming space. Never before have we had any sort of information, any sort of model that predicts injuries, plain and simple. If you're looking at this from a gaming perspective, the model's telling you player X is likely to miss X amount of time. That's actionable. It's actionable for bettors. It's actionable for sportsbooks. So this is going to affect the way that we look at football and the way that sports betting operates going forward.
Yeah, so I think mine's kind of similar to Matt's, that it's just really useful to kind of get a single number that projects this injury risk that we don't have to piece together by like, oh, this guy's missed some time here and there. It's a single number that brings all of the information we have together. And then I think one thing that it's important for other people to take away from this is it is not a binary, this player is going to get hurt, this player is not. It's a spectrum percentage that, this player has a higher risk, but that doesn't mean for sure that we're saying he is going to get hurt. It's just in general, his characteristics are going to increase the risk of being injured in the future.
All right. Thanks, guys. This wraps up the Off the Charts Football Podcast. You can make sure to check out the Sports Info Solutions blog for more coverage of this topic. For Corey March, Matt Manocherian, John Shirley, and our producer, Justin Stein, I'm Mark Simon. Thank you for listening.